Hello, welcome to the first episode of Azure Community FGS. My name is Nick Lee Chang, and I'm be one of your co-hosts, and I'm with a friend, Kevin Green.
Hi folks, welcome to this first Azure Community Enthusiasts event. So happy to see so many people joined up. Today we've got some really great speakers lined up, and I'd like to thank Nick for inviting me along to be his co-host on this first episode. So Tim, we'll let you introduce yourself first.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kevin. Greg, always great to see you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. My name's Tim Warner. I'm a full-time Pluralsight author and IT pro, and I'll be talking to you and presenting on Azure OpenAI Service today. Glad to have you with us.
Cool.
Gregor.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Gregor Suttie. I am an Azure Architect at Intercept, and tonight I'm going to be presenting about how I became an Azure Architect. So thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Gregor.
So the first session that we're going to do is on Tim Warner, and then it will be Gregor.
Cool.
So
Okay.
how would you like to do the session, Tim? Do you want to take questions at the last, or take questions during the session?
I'm happy to take questions as I go along. I have the, let me see. Do I have the public chat? I've got the private chat up here. If I switch over to comments, will that show me comments coming in? Okay.
Yeah.
I've got that, and however else, if anything that I miss, please surface it to me. Do you see the Azure portal in the screen share?
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, good. All right.
There we go.
Well, let's get going. I'm going to present for 30 minutes to you now on Azure OpenAI Service, and I'm happy again to answer any questions that you have. I will answer as candidly as I can. What you're looking at here is the Azure Management Portal, portal.azure.com, and what we're going to focus on is a new service called Azure OpenAI Service, which you can see right here. Now, you might notice when you're in the Azure portal, you may not see the Azure OpenAI Service. Chances are pretty good you won't. Unfortunately, because demand is so high, it's crushing both OpenAI and Microsoft, you have to get on a waiting list to get approved to start the service. And a good way to get on the waiting list actually is to look for the What is Azure OpenAI Service doc in the Microsoft Learn docs. Let me show you where it is. So in this What is article, if we scroll down here a little bit, how do I get access to Azure OpenAI? There's an apply now. So that's step 0, I guess, is making sure that you're approved. You'll provide your subscription ID. You get onboarded. It'll just appear from then on, and you can create your own instances of the Azure OpenAI service. Now, I don't want to presume everybody here knows what's going on under the hood, why you'd care as a business. What are we talking about? We're talking about generative artificial intelligence, and we're using the OpenAI large language models, or LLMs. What's that? Well, hopefully you have some experience with ChatGPT. ChatGPT has both individual, the public UI, which you might have used, chat.openai.com. There's a new offering from OpenAI themselves called ChatGPT Enterprise. That's what's on the screenshot here. And this provides some organizational structure around ChatGPT. You can manage your members. You can, the users get great access, better access than you would by doing the public, even the paid ChatGPT Plus, because Enterprise gives you GPT-4 and plugins, but it also defaults to using the 32K token length. So it gives you the longest conversational history of any product. So we're talking about this ability to use this high-powered large language model to have it generate original text, original source code, and then with DALL-E generate original images based on our prompts. Now, a common business concern is, all right, we see, or we're starting to see, some of the benefits of generative AI on how we might be able to integrate this with our applications and make them much smarter, that kind of thing. What are my choices? Really, if you're going to go OpenAI, your choices come down to you're either working with OpenAI directly or you're working with Microsoft. You probably know Microsoft and OpenAI have a longstanding, very lucrative partnership. And to some extent, there's some competition because really OpenAI wants to get into the enterprise world. Microsoft is already there. We have Microsoft integrating OpenAI into Azure. We have OpenAI doing ChatGPT Enterprise. And the other option, if you want to go with OpenAI, is that you can just supply a payment method at the OpenAI platform website, generate yourself an API key, and start writing requests against the models directly. Now, you should know from a privacy standpoint that when you consume the APIs from OpenAI or Microsoft, they both, that is, Microsoft and OpenAI, attest that they're not going to use your prompt data to train the models. So that's a concern when you're using ChatGPT Plus or ChatGPT Free. Even there, OpenAI is gradually, remember, we're early days with this technology. OpenAI is gradually coming to the table and giving us more controls. For example, if you're using ChatGPT Free or ChatGPT Plus, you can come into your account settings and there's a data control here where you can opt out. Whoops, it looks like I did it. Let me go back to settings, data controls. You can, let me try that one more time. There we go. Don't click anything, Tim. Just stay still. You've had enough coffee today. This chat history function, it's like, it's a little bit too much because if you turn it off, your prompts won't be used or visible by OpenAI to train the model, which is good because you never want to leak proprietary data. But it turns off one of the nicest things about ChatGPT, that ability to take a conversation that you've started on your desktop computer, and then at night in bed, you can continue on your iPad. I do that all the time. But again, when you're using the business version, you have some degree of privacy. OpenAI is not going to use that prompt data. Now, how does this fit into Azure OpenAI Service specifically? I'm a little bit biased, having been a Microsoft specialist for a couple dozen years, but we already have all of the governance and 200-something resource providers in Azure already. So you've got robust control over your keys. So when you create an instance of the Azure OpenAI service, you've got all your traditional Azure Resource Manager controls. You can store your API keys in Key Vault and rotate them on a schedule. You've got role-based access control with Azure Active Directory, now called Entra ID. One thing that's super compelling, in my opinion, is the integration between the Azure OpenAI service and private endpoint, so that a business can address the models off internet over a virtual private network or an express route connection. I mean, that's super. For some reason, my portal is really slowed to draw, as you can see. But these are some really big things. You'll find if you want to go with OpenAI, it's not anywhere near the same level of robustness. I mean, every developer would have their own set of keys, but notice that there's not a regenerate. It's just you create your keys and you track them yourself. There's not much of a guardrail around there. ChatGPT Enterprise does give you some of those guardrails, but your users are stuck in the UI. Supposedly, OpenAI is going to give API access within this ecosystem. But again, I keep coming back to the mantra, early days. You see in the tech news almost every day now, some new lawsuit or something that's cropping up against OpenAI, and it's very much a gray area. Let me step back and do a quick demo, a quick run through of assuming that you've been greenlit, that your Azure subscription is enabled for Azure OpenAI. What's the quick step-by-step Cliff's Notes? Well, step one, as you can see in the Azure portal, Microsoft put Azure OpenAI in the same basket as their other cloud-based services. Particularly, you'll notice that Azure OpenAI fits along with all the cognitive services. And if you don't know, the cognitive services have been around for a long time. They're all REST APIs. But the cognitive services are pre-trained special purpose models that are all quite mature in their own right, that can do object detection, recognition, facial recognition, speech to text, text to speech. So you might think, well, isn't this Azure OpenAI working against COG services? I like to look at it not as a strict binary either or, but a both and. Yes, you can do sentiment detection in COG services. Yes, you can do it in OpenAI. I would say experiment with both and compare your return on investment, in terms of cost, performance, and accuracy. So let me show you the creation workflow here. When we're going to create a new instance of the Azure OpenAI service, of course, we've got our subscription and resource group. We've got our location. The name does have to be globally unique because your tenant gets placed on a public DNS. It's not indicated here in the UI, but it does have to be a globally unique name. So I'll just give it one that I think is globally unique. I might have hit my quota because unless I'm missing something, it's not allowing me to choose a pricing tier. Maybe it's regional. Let me try another region. Okay. Looks like you can have, I'm learning that maybe one instance per region. There's one pricing tier at this point. Pricing's another thing to keep in mind. Because we're dealing with the same architecture really at base, these large language models that are published as REST services, you're charged based on your consumption, and you pay for both your prompt that you submit to the AI as well as the completion that comes back. That couplet is aggregated. Well, first, all of your characters are converted into values called tokens, and then you pay on that token count. So something to keep in top of mind as an application developer is how to optimize your token consumption, making your prompts as tight and concise as possible. And OpenAI also includes some parameters that you can control, the maximum number of tokens that a response will have. So you can throttle that in the name of cost management and effectiveness. So here is that important control that I think is such a value add in the Azure ecosystem, the integration with private endpoint. By default, your service is going to be dangling out on the internet as usual. We can turn off inbound internet and use private endpoint, or we can choose a hybrid approach using the service endpoint, where you can use a resource firewall to allow ingress from the internet from selected IP addresses, but also have the privacy of coming into the service on a virtual network, you see. I'm going to choose public for now. And then we've got our taxonomic tags. So that's pretty bread and butter, pretty straightforward. I have a blog that I've started, but I'm having a hard time updating. It's azureopenai.blog. And I'm pretty sure I've got a post in there that shows you some bicep code in terms of if you want to programmatically deploy an Azure OpenAI service. Of course, that's encoded in the JSON format as well as bicep if that's your thing. Notice here that within your Azure OpenAI service, you can have multiple instances. This, again, is something else that Azure brings to the table that you're not going to have if you use OpenAI directly. That you could have different organizations, different groups, having their own air-gapped service instance with their own private ingress and your own private models trained on your own private data, which, again, I think is super duper compelling. Let's go into the service that I created earlier today. And if we go to model deployments, it's going to kick us. That is, if the portal draws. Let me do a refresh here. Yikes. I hope the good old demo gods aren't going to strike me down here. Let me try that a couple more times. It's going to kick me out into a separate portal. Maybe I have it in my browser history here. Yeah, I do. You might have noticed if you have experience with other Azure data services that a lot of times the engineering team will create a separate web portal to make it easier for self-service and that kind of stuff. And that's the case with the Azure OpenAI service. Now, do your developers have to use this? Not necessarily. You should know if you are a developer that OpenAI and Microsoft, they're different companies, and to a degree, there's some contention because both of them are for-profit businesses and both of them want to make more money. They're doing their best to unify the software libraries. There's a resource I want to show you in the OpenAI platform docs. That's platform.openai.com. I guess I have had too much espresso today, but that's another story for another time. And if I go into, I think is it in the docs? It might be in the API references. No. Well, somewhere in here it is, libraries. Yeah, you'll find that the language support skews very heavily towards Python primarily and Node secondarily. That makes sense given how prevalent Python is in particular in data science, data engineering, ML, and AI. But if we scroll down the page, you can see here that Microsoft is maintaining OpenAI client libraries for other languages, of course, .NET, Java, Go, and it says here they're compatible with both. So the good news here is that if you have undertaken development on the OpenAI side and then want to migrate to Azure or vice versa, your code changes should be pretty minimal because Microsoft and OpenAI are intentionally collaborating to make those libraries as easy to use and update as possible. Okay, so back to the Azure OpenAI Studio. And your journey starts within here by creating deployments. And I'm really wondering what the heck's going on here, because before we started, I made sure to pre-bake a deployment. I created a GPT-3.5 instance here. The demo guides really are showing a deep resentment against me. I'm thinking that there may be something going on the Microsoft side. I really am. I mean, as much as I'm more likely it's the problem between my chair and keyboard issue, but this is really making me wonder if there's a capacity issue on Microsoft side. Anyway, when you create a deployment, what you're doing, especially all of these failures I'm seeing also, when you create a deployment, you're taking a base model, and it's not even showing me those. There's something going on here. And that's another point I want to mention. I also have one eye on the clock here. You have to get on another waiting list to get the GPT-4 model. It starts you off with GPT-3.5, which is it's the commonly available model version, but it's really nowhere near as intelligent as the GPT-4. However, GPT-4 is much more expensive than GPT-3. That's another whole discussion with architecture, choosing the best size model for your use case. But just something to keep in mind that if you're looking to go to GPT-4, you'll need to get on another waiting list. I'm still waiting for that, by the way. And even with somebody at Microsoft, even that didn't work. So I can only imagine how big the queue is that Microsoft is dealing with here. So you deploy n number of your own model instances, and you can start interacting with them here in the interactive playgrounds. It's important to keep in mind that GPT-3.5 and GPT-4 are multimodal models. Say that 5 times quickly. In other words, they're equally adept at text and source code generation, and you can address the model via different endpoints. There's a chat endpoint that has the language wrapping around it where it says, hey, how you doing? Let's have some coffee sometime. And then the completions endpoint is much more low to the ground. It's like, here's the prompt, here's the completion, and that's it. So depending on how you and your users are going to interact with the model, you'll use one or the other of those endpoints. And then we have DALL-E, which is the image generator. Yeah, this is really not a happy day here. Down in the list on the left-hand side here, I'm pointing, as if you can see where I'm pointing on my monitor. Look where my mouse is. Data files is where you want to go in terms of getting your model, your deployment, smart on your internal line of business data. Yet again, there's a capacity issue going on. The last time I checked that, which I think was within the last week, it's turned off for anybody who hasn't used it in the past. Again, it's capacity / early days / gray area going on. But Microsoft, I think, has done some really good engineering to try to simplify the process of getting your own internal data integrated into a GPT model. Because, I mean, the GPT model is super smart on open source data across the public internet and across GitHub and open source public code repos, but it's not going to be smart on your own proprietary data. So that is where Microsoft is trying to tread a line where you don't have to be a PhD data scientist to be able to prepare your source data. But there are some good articles in the Microsoft Learn Docs that you should look at. Do a Google or Bing search for Azure OpenAI fine-tuning, because that's what the technical term of the process is. And it'll show you that you want to get your data into a specific format. Ideally, JSON line format, where each line in your JSON file would be a separate JSON object that's a document, data, whatever it might be, that kind of situation. But ultimately, if you line up everything just so, we're talking about your business having potentially off internet access into your own private ChatGPT or just completion endpoint that you can use for the use cases are just, it depends on your business. At Pluralsight, of course, we're an educational company. I was mentioning to the guys before we started that one of many initiatives we're doing at Pluralsight with Gen AI is making it a lot cheaper because we don't have to hire writers, but also a lot faster to create assessment questions and summaries for our courses. You could take a video course, could be as short as 45 minutes, or it could be as long as 16 hours. And it's equally easy to export the transcript, the audio track from the course, feed it into Gen AI and say, give me evaluation questions that are this format, and then give an explanation why the correct answer is correct and the incorrect answers are incorrect. Give some citations. Give me a one-page executive summary of this course, and it'll just as happily give you a result for a 30-minute course as a 30-hour course. And I know from personal experience how tedious and painful doing that work manually is. And that's just one example. I know when I was at Microsoft, towards the tail end of my time there, they were starting to get their toes in the water of using GPT to generate and enrich docs content. You know how fast the cloud works. Again, that was historically a manual process, prone to human error and prone to long delays, because the writer doesn't hear about this new change until customers are yelling about it. The engineering team has so many plates spinning, they never thought to tell the docs people about it. Meanwhile, you can have Gen AI be much more proactive in terms of incorporating recent changes and auto-generating content. So language translation, sentiment analysis. From a code standpoint, there's all of the integrations now with GitHub Copilot, for example, and Microsoft. I noticed just yesterday that when I updated Windows 11, I'm not in an insiders program either, but I noticed here that I've got this beta version of Microsoft Copilot powered by Bing Chat. I haven't really played with it much yet, but I think we're going to see this integration of GPT show up more and more, certainly across the Microsoft ecosystem, but with third parties as well. Let me pause to take a breath. Anybody have any questions? Nick, are there any questions that you've noticed bubble up in chat that you'd like to surface? No? Can you all hear me? Yeah, this isn't working here in the Azure OpenAI studio. There's something going on. Let's see. Let me take a quick look here in the chat. I see that there's quite a bit. Strange question. Oh, it's hard to parse through all these. Okay, I'm seeing one person was approved for GPT-4. That's good. That's good to see. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll waste no more time reading. Let me finish out my last few minutes by sweeping up some shavings. Some other things to look forward to, really. OpenAI is just tripping over themselves with innovations, and a lot of those innovations are going to take a little while for Microsoft to pick them up with Azure OpenAI Service. So some things that OpenAI has on its side, particularly in ChatGPT, is the plugin architecture. These, it's taken a while for these to be API accessible. Right now, you have to use the ChatGPT UI here at chat.openai.com. But in terms of with an eye towards the future and things that you might want to get smart on earlier rather than later, would be these plugins. In particular, this one from OpenAI themselves, this advanced data analysis plugin, is a really big deal. what you can do is upload your source data. Like I might have, let's see, I've got a JSON file here, a pretty big JSON file that has, it's just a public data set with Volcano data in it. And you can submit up to like 12 files at a time, and the max file size for each file is something like 512 megabytes. So you can send a substantial amount of source data into the AI and generate business intelligence, insights. You can have it generate visualizations. You can even have it spit out a report to summarize what you've been dealing with in your analysis with the AI. And it'll give you the report in PDF or Word. It'll even give you PowerPoint presentations. I've been playing with this plugin a lot lately. And that may be something that your business or your customers or clients may be interested in getting into, is plugin development. Basically, the plugin architecture in ChatGPT is similar to how it works with like Azure Logic apps, or those where you're just calling another API. You're within the GPT API and you're making a call to an external API. So it's pretty straightforward, but this advanced data analysis is more robust yet. I'm just going to say, tell me what you see in this data. Give me a table showing some rows and generate a representative visualization of volcano eruptions in the globe. I'm just coming up with this prompt off the top of my head. But I've been really impressed in particular with this particular plugin. Originally, it was called the Code Interpreter plugin, but then OpenAI realized that was too limiting of a name, because you can do serious exploratory data analysis with this. Because what you're doing is you're interacting with a cloud container or a cloud VM, I'm not exactly sure which, in addition to the large language model. And what that compute is doing, it's using Python to do everything. And it shows its work, as you can see here, which can be useful if you're a Python developer, particularly because you can copy the code out. But it's giving us, let's see, I'm going to just say go ahead. So it's just telling us what it's doing and asking us permission to continue. So we're literally exploring with the AI as we go along here. And time is of the issue here, so I'm going to stop at this point. But hopefully this lightning round discussion is giving you some lay of the land in terms of possibilities. First of all, OpenAI directly or Microsoft. If Microsoft, get on the waiting list, create an instance of the service, create a deployment, consider your options for using GPT-4. Look at other Azure Resource Manager capabilities that can augment your work with the service. And then from a development standpoint, I've mentioned this to Greg during our recent convo. He already knows this. It's just REST API work. Ultimately, I mean, you could do it in Postman. It's just HTTP requests back and forth to the services. So from a programming standpoint, I don't want to say it's dead simple, but if you're familiar with how REST APIs work, it's pretty darn straightforward. So with that, I'll just say thank you. I don't have a slide deck or anything. If you want to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn, or certainly if you go to the Pluralsight website, my email address is tim-warner@pluralsight.com. Thanks again for having me, and I'll turn it back to you, Nick, and I'm happy to tackle any questions that you might identify.
Sorry, Tim. So Gregor asks what DAL-E3 within Bing just announced might be stretching out servers.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
I'm not sure what you meant.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're talking huge demand. I mean, DALL-E is the image generator, and DALL-E 3 is the latest version. And again, it's leaps and bounds ahead of DALL-E 2. And if Bing is now offering that, I can see where that would swamp their infrastructure.
Yeah. Tim, could you just discuss about the token? How OpenAI?
Yeah, sure. Let me quickly go to platform.openai.com/tokenizer. This is kind of an old app, but it does the trick.
Yeah.
Basically, as I said, you're charged on your consumption of both your prompt and the completion together. And then in ChatGPT, it maintains a history. And basically what that means, because REST is stateless, it means that all of the previous prompts and completions are added. So you're aggregating against a token count. Behind the scenes, when you submit the request, those words are converted into tokens. And OpenAI says that it's about, where do they say it? It's about 4 characters of text for a token. And so this is a graphical tokenizer. In Azure OpenAI, the playgrounds show you the token count. And you also programmatically, you should know that, I know the Python library is called tick token, but I'm sure there's other variants for .NET. But those are useful because you can see your token counts without actually submitting API requests. So you want to keep that token count in mind because you're paying for it, and you want to take advantage of libraries like tick token where you can quantify those tokens without burning up actual API calls. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Sorry. One question to myself, Tim. Does GPT-4 use token or use a separate token from GPT-3?
All of the GPT models, regardless of their version, use tokens.
Okay.
And my understanding is that the tokenization is the same. Under the hood, there's various, what are they called? Basically token algorithms. And there is a different algorithm for each GPT version, but it's the same for all of them. I mean, a different algorithm, but it's the same process. DALL-E is different. DALL-E, you're charged based on the generation.
Yeah,
that's not tokenized.
Okay.
It's per image generation.
Brilliant. So we've got a question here called, can't pronounce his name, so sorry, apologies. So it's saying, Tim, would be able to talk about privacy issue with OpenAI, whether and how Azure OpenAI could keep your data safe?
Right. When you're using Azure OpenAI, Microsoft documents that they'll not use your prompt data or your fine tunings that you do to your own models to train. So Microsoft attests to that right off the top. Yeah. And if you want more privacy yet, that would be a case where you want to look at private link, where you're interacting with your Azure OpenAI service off internet using a virtual network private link, where you're using private non-internet routable IP addresses. Lastly, I'll say that in Azure, when you're doing fine tuning, you'll be storing your source data in Azure Data Lake or Azure Blob Service. And there you've got the option to use customer managed encryption keys. So you could either trust Microsoft with the at-rest encryption key, or you can maintain that key yourself. So yes, there's plenty of good go-tos to cover that privacy check mark with Azure OpenAI Service.
Tim, sorry, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great session. And as we talked about just before the stream, we've started getting more I'm from an IT pro background, and we've even started getting more into AI in the context of Azure AI as opposed to the OpenAI, the ChatGPT. And the last question probably is very relevant in what a lot of customers and a lot of organizations want to know. What's the difference? OpenAI is OpenAI, Azure AI. I know all of the Microsoft marketing are very, very clear that they are 2 separate companies, same APIs, obviously, and the same kind of technology in the background. But there are pros and cons of using both. And I suppose another question, and one I posed to you, Tim, because I know I've followed you for many years myself, and your background would be similar. Is it only developers or data scientists who can get into this AI stuff from a corporate or an enterprise perspective? What's your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, the first thing I normally tell customers, clients, and students is that if you're already in Azure, your decision is at least a lot of it may be already made for you. But if you're really evaluating OpenAI directly or Microsoft equal, I mean, as I mentioned, I think over the last half hour, Azure has so many controls, from cost management and budgeting controls to role-based access control to private endpoint. To me, there's really no comparison. Why might you want to consume the APIs directly from OpenAI? Well, you're going to get first access to new features. like that plugin integration I was talking about, that's here. And it will be, if it's not in the API yet, it will be soon. And then there's going to be some latency before it shows up. So if your business really wants to be on the edge and wants first access to features, then you'd probably want to go here. I will say that if you decide to go with OpenAI rather than Azure OpenAI, you still have the privacy. In other words, OpenAI says in their attestation that they won't take any of your data. Even if you do fine tuning with OpenAI, they won't use any of that in their training. So you do have that confidentiality, but you don't have the private endpoint. You'll still be going over the internet, so you'll have to rely on TLS for your HTTPS, and you'll be trusting OpenAI that their at-rest encryption is up to snuff. I mean, they're pretty open about what they've got on their back end. They're SOC 2 compliant, for example, and I think their at-rest is AES 256. So they document this stuff on their side. Now, the second half of your question was about developers, I think.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that, developer?
Yeah, no problem. So again, these are common queries that we get either from the community in general or even from customers. You know, if Gregor's going to talk to the folks online here in his own session about becoming, say, an Azure Architect. Mm-hmm. But this AI stuff can be quite alien to, I guess, most folks, right? It's new technology. But my question or my point is, should it be just folks with developer backgrounds or data architect, data scientist backgrounds that can get hands-on with this outside of just your traditional ChatGPT style model? Or can your traditional IT pro, which is where a lot of Microsoft folks have come from, can we get involved in either the OpenAI or the Azure AI services?
Mm-hmm. Okay. From a developer standpoint, unless the developer predates RESTful services and they're just cleaving to Win32 with all their might, they may have a learning curve, but I would submit the majority of developers should be familiar with the development ecosystem here. It's not any different from addressing any other RESTful service, at least from what I've seen. That shouldn't be an issue. I think there's also a place for the data scientist for sure, particularly with the fine-tuning piece. However, as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft is trying to ease that by putting kind of a front end on top of the fine-tuning process. If you're going to go with OpenAI, it'd probably be more sophisticated where you would want to have maybe somebody more skilled with data science and data engineering. But on the Azure side, they've tried to make it relatively turnkey, where you'll want to make sure your data is formatted properly, but then you just upload it and then let the big compute do the fine-tuning for you. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. I think there's a place for everybody. There's a place
totally
for the...
Yeah, it totally is. And it's that bring your own data. You showed it with the plugins in the OpenAI, which are pretty cool. But what I would say as a Microsoft consultant to our customers is you're already in that security context of your Entra ID, if you like, and you've got maybe your hybrid file shares, and you've got all of that traditional infrastructure and IaaS in the cloud. And then you've got the additional, as you say, you've got the front end, the UI that's making it a little bit easier to understand how to link in and connect. You've also got a bunch of data connectors in preview that may connect you to things like SharePoint, Azure file shares, stuff like that. So it is opening the doors to the traditional IT pro if you want to get hands-on with it, but also from a developer / data architect scientist kind of role, there's a lot of work that can be done on that side as you get deeper into more complex scenarios. So that was probably the point, more just giving folks an idea. You don't need to be a developer or a data scientist to be able to do that type of stuff.
Exactly.
One last question I get a lot of, and I'd love to just hear your explanation for the audience. All of the marketing at the moment around AI, well, a lot of it is around Copilot. And we spoke a little bit about the Bing Copilot. We get asked quite a bit, hey, is this Copilot? Is that what you're talking about, Azure AI? I know it's not, but what's your take on the difference between Copilot in the Microsoft context and Azure AI service?
Yeah, there's a lot of fuzzy lines because GitHub Copilot and GitHub Copilot X, the next generation, are both using the GPT model. The release version of GitHub Copilot's using GPT 3.5 Turbo. If you're using GitHub Copilot Chat, that's using GPT-4. It is the same model, but it's being managed by yet a different group, this time GitHub. So there's no question it's confusing. It is the same model, so it operates the same basic way from a prompt perspective, but it's owned by a different group of people. Still Microsoft, of course, because it's GitHub. But yes.
Cool. I think we've got a question up there from Amaya. I hope I pronounced your name right. What are your thoughts on companies trying to do anything and everything with their data and AI without understanding what they do with the results or even knowing what they want?
There's certainly a time and a place for experimentation, but yeah, of course I'd advise caution. I mean, there's a reason why businesses are administratively blocking their users from using the ChatGPT public application, because by default, that public ChatGPT UI, OpenAI can see those conversations and will use them in their training data set. And you don't want customer data, payment methods, API keys, whatever, going into those prompts. So for a business to tumble headlong, this isn't the kind of technology you want to do that with. I mean, you're going to be safer when you're consuming the OpenAI APIs directly rather than the ChatGPT public application. And that also is true for Azure OpenAI. But no, you want to be careful. I was working with a customer earlier today, as a matter of fact, and I suggested the training wheels approach is just personally load up the ChatGPT app on your phone or whatever and just get accustomed to asking the AI questions without proprietary data, of course, but just innocuous stuff to just start to get into the flow and start to think of some possibilities of how generative AI can help.
Yeah, and even there's a new kind of term. I know a friend of mine from the old system center world, which was where my background came from originally. A couple of years back, he kind of changed his title on LinkedIn to prompt engineer. And I'd never heard of that term, never heard of what a prompt engineer was. And that in itself can be a dark art, right? Because I love the advice, get hands-on, Tim, with OpenAI, with ChatGPT, just play with it, ask it funny, cool things, whatever you want. Very similar to the Amazon Echo and the Google Home that people had. My kids are constantly, used to ask it to, do a fart noise and stuff like that. When you get to a point, I think, that there's simple prompts that you're putting in, one-liners, maybe two-liners. But when you look at, and I know you'll have seen a lot of this, Tim, the really advanced prompts can be literally paragraphs, and it can be very descriptive when you get to an advanced level of prompt engineering. And that's what I mean. It can kind of be a dark art in itself to try and get it right. I love the demo that you did with the OpenAI, where it kind of did a little bit and it stopped and said, "Hey, are you sure? Do you want to continue?" At least it's not going off on its own tangent, and it's nearly learning as you're learning. But there's a whole area, I suppose, of ramp up that folks would need to do, and it's not super technical. It's just understanding what those prompts are, what works for you, what works for your business. And purely around prompt engineering before you even get into technology.
Yeah, prompt engineering is a real thing. It's a unicorn job position. I have yet to meet a real prompt engineer who's actually earning their living with that, but I suspect strongly that it will be a common job role, because the prompt is how you program the model. And what's so funny, and I'm fortunate because I've been a professional writer for a long time, rather than learning Python or a .NET language, prompt engineering, you really should pick up some training on technical writing. Seriously, because the accuracy of the response or the completion is entirely dependent on how good your prompt is. And does it necessarily have to be a great big huge honking paragraph? No, not necessarily. In fact, you're paying for those words. So I think that the shortest, the most concise yet accurate prompt is going to be probably the best one, generally speaking.
Great tip. Great. And another way of looking at it as well is, if folks are using DevOps for their infrastructure as code, they're storing their code, their templates, prompts need to be stored. Like the better your prompts are, whether they're one-liners or whether they're small paragraphs, if you can get into a scenario where you're storing and you've got a central location for you or your team, for example, where you can revert back for different scenarios and build up that library of prompts, if you like, well, then you're on to a winner already, I think.
I think we'll eventually see that in Azure OpenAI Service. ChatGPT Enterprise does have that capability now where you can create prompt templates and share them with your team. Eventually, I would envision that that'll bubble over to Azure OpenAI Service.
Cool. That's all for me. That was great. Thanks,
all right.
So,
thanks. I can't wait to hear Greg.
Yeah, I got no more questions, so it's going to be down to Greg.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen and unmute.
Yeah,
can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, let me just get me sorted. All right, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for spending some time on Monday with me and with Tim, Nick, and Kevin. Nearly forgot your name there, Kevin. So, welcome, everyone. I'm going to chat about how I became an Azure architect. So, what I would suggest is if you guys come back in the chat and you can just ask questions to me and answer the questions if you want as we go. So, I've only got 5 slides. So, there's not a lot of slides here. We'll see how we go on. Right, next slide. So, my name is Gregor Suttie. I am an Azure MVP. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. I also go by the pseudonym of Azure Greg. And if you want to follow me, that's my Twitter handle at the bottom. I'm not going to call it X because nobody really calls it X, let's be honest. Just before we go any further, I am running a thing in December, which is called the Festive Tech Calendar. So it's the festivetechcalendar.com is the website. So anyone who does anything in tech, if you go to that website, there's a call for speakers. We run an event every day in December on any tech. So it doesn't have to be Azure. It can be AWS, as we spit. Any cloud, any technology. Anyone who submits a session is guaranteed to take part. And last year we had about 130. So please do have a look at that. That's my last plug for the day, I promise. So today's agenda, just before we go any further, Mark Rusnovich announced bing.com/create. So DALL-E 3 has just been announced when bing.com. So I typed in, funnily enough, what does an Azure architect look like? And it come up with that image on the right here. So this is, so I did that the minute it was announced, and there's now a massive wait line. So I think that's why your AI demos wouldn't work, because I think the Azure portal and AI is probably getting hammered. So that was interesting. Yeah, so the agenda for tonight is how I became an Azure architect. I'm going to go through 10 tips for becoming an Azure architect. I'm also going to address some of the questions in the chat about, I think, what was the person's name? It was Bhavesh was asking about how to get started in Azure. Feel free to ask lots of questions as we go. I'm only got some notes on the screen here, so I'm just going to go for it. And then feel free to ask any questions anytime. And if you want to reach out to me, I'll just put a slide up and then I'll stop sharing the screen. At Gregor Suttie on Twitter, Gregor Suttie on LinkedIn, and Gregor Suttie on YouTube. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm just going to chat. All right, let me move this over here. Right, so I am an Azure architect at a company called Intercept. They are in the Netherlands, so I live in Scotland, just to the east of Glasgow. I've worked for Intercept for just over 3 years. I started learning Azure in 2018, so in 5 years I've went from zero Azure knowledge to a fair bit, and I'll go through what I did to get there and how I went about it, and spending lots of time learning it. I'm an Azure MVP. I've been an MVP for 5 years now. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. So part of my job, I get to go to do workshops around the Microsoft offices in Europe for Intercept, and I get to deliver, excuse me, my voice is going. I get to deliver workshops covering all sorts of Azure content. So how did I get started? In my previous two jobs, I worked for a large American bank, and the cloud was just starting to take off. Unfortunately, they only had an internal cloud, and I've been a Microsoft guy for 28 years, believe it or not. I know I don't look that old, but yeah, I am 46, unfortunately. So yeah, they wanted to do internal cloud and build their own, and I was like, nah, I want to go and learn Azure, because Microsoft guy, Microsoft fanboy, now an Azure fanboy, I'll put my hand up to that. So yeah, wanted to go and learn some Azure. So I took a dev manager's job. I know that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I took a dev manager's job in my last role where we started looking at Azure and kind of building stuff out. So I've been doing Azure for 5 years. So I started off by probably doing what I'm not going to recommend. So Bhavesh, you were asking, how do you get started in Azure? Definitely, if you've come out of uni or you have no Azure experience whatsoever, definitely start off with Microsoft Learn modules. So if you've got Microsoft Learn, and start there, and definitely start with the Azure fundamentals. So there's a course called AZ-900, which will tell you all about the fundamentals of Azure. It also covers the fundamentals of cloud, so it's not just Azure. But definitely start with that. You were asking about DP 203, I think it was, the data engineer role, I think it was. My advice for you would be start off with AZ-900. I think everyone should do that exam. I've even done it after being an architect for 2 years. I went back and did it. I actually learned some things, which is quite interesting. It was good. Recommend everyone starts with that. Then you might get a flavour for what you want to do after that. So if you want to do data, there's the fundamentals data exam. A bit like if you want to do AI, there's an AI fundamentals exam. So go and have a look at that. So you should probably do AZ-900. Then there's DP-900, which is the Azure Fundamentals for data. And then take a look at doing DP-203. But definitely go in kind of that order. Don't try and jump in and miss some stuff. Definitely start off with the fundamentals. Right, what else are we going to do? So what does an Azure Architect do? Some people ask me what do I do when I'm playing golf, and I'm like, good question. So as an Azure Architect, I help customers. I work for Intercept, who mainly work with software companies. They're called ISVs, independent software vendors. So these companies have developers, they have solutions. Most of them, or some of them, have them on-prem, and we help them get into the cloud, which is Azure. We also have customers who are already in the cloud, and our job is to try and improve their cloud footprint. Things like security, governance, all that kind of good stuff. And sometimes we just design solutions for customers. So there's times where we're just writing a design. There's also, during the day, I'll be doing things like cost scans, security scans. So for that, I'll spend like a day writing a document, going through their entire Azure estate and documenting the best practices and what they should do to try and make that better. So an Azure Architect is across all of Azure. So that's kind of scary. So to be honest, when I first started doing Azure, and when I first became an Azure Architect, I didn't know anything about Azure, well, very little about Azure. So I had to learn on the job. So that's one thing I would also say. Don't worry about learning on the job, because I've done it, and you just have to keep learning as you go in. We'll cover some content you can look at further on in this session about how you can get more experience and more hands-on. I always tell people it's like learning to fly a plane. If you were reading about learning to fly a plane and then I sat you in a plane, you would be like, what is this? You wouldn't have a clue what to do, let's be honest. So you can't learn Azure just by reading and doing courses. You have to get hands-on. Do the courses, but hands-on labs is probably kind of the best way to go. I see some questions coming in. Do you want me to answer these, or? So when you design solutions, do you personally spend time in implementing them? Yes. So what we tend to do is we'll have a call with the customer. So I have an initial call with the customer. The customer will ask all sorts of questions about Azure. I'll ask all sorts of questions about their solutions. What have they done? What have they not done? What kind of, maybe it's .NET, is it C#? What kind of languages they're using? What kind of services do they need? I'll write a full, probably, I think we take about 2 to 3 days to do a full Azure deep dive design document. And then I'll phone the customer back and talk them through it, and then we'll probably iterate on the design diagram. So we use like PowerPoint or Visio to draw the diagram that I think that they need, and then I'll chat to them, and then I'll always ask questions like all of the AI questions, like what about security, what about governance, and I fill them all in that. Excuse me. I try and cover all of that in the design document, and that's usually version 9. And then once the customer signs that off, that's version 1. And then I go about implementing that using things like Bicep and PowerShell and things like that. So yeah, good question. Keep the questions coming. Okay, so how do you learn Azure and get hands-on? So I started doing Azure every single day. In the previous job, I wasn't doing Azure every day, so I would spend 2 to 3 hours every night reading, opening the portal, adding things like VNets. As Kevin probably laughs, I have a development background. I am not an IT ops person at all. Networking is not my thing and probably never ever will be. I'm a C# developer. I'm actually a VB6 developer, but again, I'm probably showing my age. VB6, .NET, SQL Server, that kind of thing. So data and development background. Don't have any experience in servers and IT ops stuff. I know I'm probably butchering what IT ops people do, but yeah, that's not what I did. So I came and became an Azure architect from a developer's background, which is probably a little bit unusual. Most people are IT ops and then move into the cloud and help migrate servers into the cloud. That's not really what I do. I tend to get a lot of the customer questions on, we have a .NET app and we want to move it to .NET Core. What do we need to do to get it into Azure? Do we need to containerize it, or do we need to do app service plans, web apps, all that good stuff, private endpoints? I'm talking to customers about all that kind of good stuff. So when I first started learning Azure, I actually did the wrong thing where I jumped straight in and tried to do the developer exams, which back then were DP 201 and DP 202. They're probably no longer anymore. I think it's moved on from those numbers. This was just doing some hands-on labs and tinkering with the docs. I didn't really spend a lot of time hands-on, which I probably should have. And I failed both narrowly. But I saw that as a win because before I started studying, I tried to do the practice exams, and I was getting like very little score. So one of my top tips is to try and do a test exam at the start before you learn stuff. Go through the questions, take a note of your score out of like 50 questions, and then once you start reading and learning, go back after a couple of months and retake that test. And that's what I did. And although I failed the developer exams, I had like 680 out of 700 out of 1,000. The pass mark being 700, so I was very close to passing them. So I saw that as a win, even though I failed them. I then realized that I was doing the wrong thing and I should go back to do the fundamentals. And then that's kind of what I said earlier. Start with the fundamentals and build your skills up. Don't jump in. That's the mistake that I made. And please don't follow me because that's not the way to go. Build on the fundamentals and then find out do the AZ900, then pick a fundamentals one that suits what you want to do. So if you want to do data, go that way. If you want to do AI, go that way. If you want to do admin, go that way. But definitely try and figure out what you want to do and go from there. Don't sit the exams and do what I did. So one thing I would like to also say is, somebody always asked me who helped me learn Azure. There's 4 answers to that, and the first answer is me. I am a keen learner. I am one of the keenest learners you will ever meet. I want to know everything. I want to know how everything works. That's the developer in me. If somebody says it's black magic, I'm not having that. I want to figure out what's going on under the covers. So you have to have a bit of an appetite for trying to learn that stuff. The other 3 people I'd like to give a shout out to is Scott Duffy. So I first started doing courses on Udemy with Scott Duffy, and that's kind of how I started my hands-on learning. Once I went back to do the fundamentals, I was doing courses by Scott Duffy, Mike Pfeiffer, and also some guy called Tim Warner, who you might recognise, who's on this and was on earlier. So shout out to Tim. I did many of Tim's Pluralsight courses. I was working at a company. I was lucky enough to get access to Pluralsight. So shout out to him. So thanks for that.
So we've got a question here.
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks, Greg. And if I have more of an ops background with implementing workloads on things like AKS, Azure Storage, VNet, what you recommend to move into a solution architect?
Good question. So can you put the question back up? Sorry, we have more of an ops background. Things like AKS. Yeah, so the thing about becoming a solutions architect is you kind of need to probably get to the point where you've sat the solutions architecture exam, which covers all of Azure. Now, Azure is enormous. There's hundreds and hundreds of services. I think there's over, 700 odd, maybe a lot more than that. There's no way you're going to be able to be an expert in all of that. So I coined a phrase when I was at JP Morgan of a T-shaped developer. And the idea behind that was you would go like a little bit into all of these services and go deep on one. So I'm kind of like a developer. I go deep on the development strain of Azure, and I try and keep abreast of all of the other stuff. So we'll pick an area in Azure that you want to try and be an expert in, is what I would recommend, and go down that route. But try and keep your eye on everything else that's going on. Now that's very, very difficult, as we'll come on to in a bit. But I'll cover off how I try and keep up to date with Azure. But as we all know, it's impossible. There's new service updates daily, hourly, weekly. It's just incredibly difficult to do. So there's certain things that I don't learn. Like I don't learn AKS because I'm not a fan of AKS. I never will be. And that's just it's probably a controversial opinion. But yeah, I'm not going to learn AKS. So I'm not going to spend time looking into that. I'm going to spend time looking into pretty much everything else apart from that and networking. They're the two things that not that great at and probably won't do. If I tried to become an expert in all of this stuff, you just have no time to do anything. I'd be spending my entire week, nights learning, which I used to do. I don't really do that as much now, but yeah. So try and pick an area that you want to be an expert in and do that. Like Bhavesh was talking about data. So he could probably do the fundamentals and then move on to become an Azure data engineer. And probably that's his area. Amaya, your area might be whatever. Kevin, looks like you've got a question.
Yeah, well, it's more just to give because I'm coming from the IT pro background, so it's actually good that we have the developer background and the IT pro background. If you've not heard of the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, I suggest you check it out. You can download it. It's a whole framework that Microsoft have released and curated over the years, over the last few years, to align to best practices for specifically around architecture and Azure architecture. So if you're not familiar with it, we'll drop a link into the chat. The Cloud Adoption Framework, you can download it. It's like a big, huge manual if you want to download it. It's over 900 pages. I have never read it from start to finish, so don't think you got to do that, right? But it's really, really good. I mean, Gregor, the process that you guys do with regards to engaging with customers and architecting, it's very similar. You know, you start out with your kind of collaboration. You then start out with your DevOps. So set up a DevOps platform of choice to be ready for whatever code and whatever design decisions come in. Then what we do is we work with the customer on a high-level design document, which is fully aligned with the Cloud Adoption Framework. So things like networking, governance, security, and management. So, you know, when you've got the workloads in the cloud, whether you're migrating them or whether you're spinning up new ones, how do you manage the costs? Like there's all these different areas. And if you don't have a defined process, either for yourself or for if you're working as a consultant in a company for your company, well, then it's like the Wild West. You will literally go out and you'll miss stuff and you'll go be deploying a virtual machine here or a database there, or, hey, the AI stuff looks cool, let's spin that up. And if you don't have a properly constructed and architected what's referred to as a landing zone that aligns to something like the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, you are only asking for trouble down the road, for either from a security perspective or even a cost management perspective, where you might get hit or your customer might get hit for a €10,000 bill or a £10,000 bill, wherever you're from. So be aware of that. But the Cloud Adoption Framework will be a good recommendation, coupled with, you know, to talk about my certification journey. I'm on the Azure trail probably 5.5 years. I've known about Azure for about 10 years, but really kind of getting my hands on with it. And I made a decision to start with the Azure Fundamentals exam to begin with, even though I didn't have to. But I thought, you know what, there's always something new to be learned. There's always something to be gained. I learned a bunch of stuff from that one. And then I did the Azure Administrator, then the Architect, then the Design, then the DevOps, and kind of kept moving through all the various certifications from then. And I think we've dropped some links to Microsoft Learn already in the chat. If you start with the fundamentals, if you want to go down the IT Pro or Administrator route, you can. If you want to go down the data or developer route, you can, no problem. There are fundamentals exams for each of them. So that's probably my 10 cents on what I would recommend to get started as, at least as an Azure architect, because you need that architecture knowledge, regardless of whether you go deep into data or you stay on the IT Pro side.
Yep, you just stole my thunder.
But we're singing off the same page, though, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah,
we're both Azure MVPs. We both work for Azure Expert to MSP organizations, right? So if we did things completely differently,
yeah,
well,
you'd be worried.
something's not aligned. It should, like,
Yeah,
we're all drinking the Microsoft Kool-Aid. We're
Yep.
all working with the Microsoft platform, and we need to follow Microsoft's guidance as to how to do it, and just obviously understand all those ins and outs as well. So
Yeah. Right. So moving on. I've got 10 tips for becoming an Azure architect. So I'm just going to go through these. But if there are questions, then definitely shout out.
So
So
there's
the
a
first one's foundational knowledge. Okay, do you want me to answer this?
Yeah. So question, Alan. So do you feel that these skills are transferable to other cloud framework or like AWS GCP? What would you say if asked by why someone would learn Azure or do Azure exam first?
Yeah, I mean, things like the well-architected framework and the CAF are they're not really just Azure specific. They're more kind of cloud generic documents. Yeah, so yeah, you can absolutely use these for different cloud solutions. It's the same sort of thing. You know, you need governance, you need security, you need to make sure it's the least privilege. All these kind of things that are in the document. But the document, the CAF also, the Cloud Adoption Framework also talks about how companies migrate into Azure. So if you have no idea how to get started and you're wanting to get started as a company in Azure, the Cloud Adoption Framework in its name will help you with that as well. So it covers getting started all the way through to having things like Azure landing zones and making sure it's well architected. These are the kind of buzzwords that we hear a lot, but a landing zone for things like AKS is you could have your Azure landing zone in AKS, which Richard Hooper's done at Intercept. He's scripted it all. And basically, if a customer comes along and says, we need AKS, you launch this script, you run it, and you now have a landing zone, which is all the best practices recommended by Microsoft from things like CAF and the well-architected framework documents that these Microsoft give you. So, yeah, to answer your question, they're absolutely transferable. Yeah, you still need security. You still need governance. You still need least privilege. You still need to do cost management. All these things are applicable to all clouds. So absolutely, yeah.
And some are easier in one cloud than the other, right?
Mhm.
Like AWS, their equivalent to the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework is the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework.
Yeah.
Obviously, it has their own terms, and if you're very comfortable with Azure terminology, and you try and then understand some of the names, like my biggest ramp up on AWS for me, and I'm not super strong on AWS, but again, I'm sure if I had a few months at it because of all the knowledge I have on the Microsoft cloud, it would be fine. Biggest challenge for me with AWS, and probably the URL that I reference the most, is that Microsoft have a table, or well, a page on their doc site that has a table containing all of the Azure resource names or types and the AWS equivalent. So, for example, Azure Virtual Machines are virtual machines. In AWS, it's EC2, Elastic Compute 2, right? If you don't know AWS, you don't know that they're virtual machines. So it's kind of learning that. But under the hood, they all need networks. They all need, as Gregor said, security, governance, cost management. So yeah, totally transferable. I suppose what we find is a lot of folks, at least here in Ireland anyway, a lot of folks who are big into the AWS platform either were early starters because Microsoft came late to that party, or developers love AWS. I find a lot of organizations who have a background primarily as a development company, maybe like an ISV, and they would most certainly feel stronger, more comfortable in the AWS world, which is what AWS was originally set out for, was for developers. And Google, we don't see a huge amount of ask for Google. The education sector, because of all the cheap licenses, but Google's not super strong over here. But again, I guess the same concepts would be applicable.
Indeed, yeah. Okay, so I think you need one. So we'll go through the 10 foundational knowledge. So you need to understand the cloud computing concepts, including the benefits and challenges. You need to familiarize yourself with the services. So if someone asks you about a service, you kind of need to know about it a little bit. If you do the AZ900 exam, you'll also learn about Azure's pricing and support models, which is something I didn't know too much about. So that's quite interesting. We talked about getting certified, so that was the second kind of tip. The third one was hands-on experience. So There's nothing to stop you setting up your free personal account in Azure, figuring this stuff out. Like, if you don't know anything about data, just spin up some stuff and I'll go through the Microsoft Learn content. So search for whatever you're interested in. Look at the Azure Architecture Center to get an idea of kind of maybe how these services work together, and just hands-on learning. That is how you'll learn. If you make mistakes, you'll figure it out. That's the best way to learn anything, I think. If you were learning to drive a car, you need to be in the car and try it and figure out what the clutch and all that, the biting point and all that is. You don't get that from reading a book or watching a course. You need to watch the course and then do the thing. So definitely spend lots of time in Azure playing with it. That's what I did. The also thing we're talking about was staying up to date. Now, this is really difficult, but there are lots of people who have created lots of great resources for things like this. There's a guy called Luke Murray in New Zealand, and he's teamed up with Dan McLaughlin, and they have a great update. What's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like a blog post that comes out every I think it's every week, that has all of the updates in Azure. So that's one thing you can kind of subscribe to these community things to keep you up to date. There's also Azure Updates, which you can go and look at, and it'll give you a list of what's been updated when. The thing to keep an eye out for is things like private preview. And so a private preview is when some companies get access to things that's private, that Microsoft kind of gate, but then the service moves to what's called public preview, which means anyone can use it. So you can actually go to, I think it's preview.portal.azure.com. You can go and test this stuff out. So you can keep abreast of all of the things that are coming and get a note of what's coming and when. So you can definitely do that. The other thing I've got is tip number 5 is networking. So there's people networking and there's networking as a service. I'm talking about people networking here. So one of the best things you can do is join communities like this and get to know everyone and ask questions. So join as many Azure user groups as you can. Even if they're remote, you can always still watch them. There's hundreds of user groups across the world. There's hundreds of events going on. There's lots of Microsoft free days where you can go and learn about AI, like Tim was talking about, and all sorts of things. So definitely go that. Definitely try and attend one in person and network with the people there. That's what I did. I now help run the Glasgow Azure user group. And that came about just from attending it and then asking annoying questions like I always do all of the time. Sarah's like, stop asking questions. Can you please help out? So that's how that came about. And just engage with other people.
Yeah. I have a question, Greg. It's just for myself. So
yeah,
what's the difference between an Azure architect and a solution architect? Because like some companies have solution architect.
Just title. Really, there's nothing really. A solutions architect is the same as an Azure architect. So at the end of the day, you're designing and implementing solutions for customers. So it's really just a title. Okay, some places you'll be an
solution.
Yeah, solution architect. Or a solution architect might be someone who does not just Azure. They might be doing .NET, for example, on-prem. So that's it's the same sort of thing, but one might be just for Azure and one might be for different types of solutions on different types of frameworks.
I think if you're going to define it, it should be Azure Data Solutions Architect or Azure AI Solutions Architect. But if you've got an Azure Architect and an Azure Solutions Architect, I totally agree with Gregor. To me, it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're specific in the title as to what specific solutions you're delivering, it's the one solution.
Okay. Yeah. So could you talk about like what if like you work in a company and you got no exposure to like designing for end-to-end solution like in projects? Can you
so when I first joined Intercept, I didn't have too much Azure knowledge, I'll be honest with you about that. I knew a little bit, enough to be dangerous, but so I would just sit and talk to the people who were Azure architects and had more experience than I did. So like for Kevin, for example, if I joined Kevin's company and I was a junior, I would sit with Kevin and say, right, Kevin, you've done this design. Can we talk through it? So I would pick a design that was already done, look at the document and kind of try and figure out what's going on and ask lots of questions. That's the thing. People are always a little bit scared to say, I don't know what this is or I don't understand it. You should never be afraid to ask or just say, like, I don't know what this does. Can you please explain it? I do that on a daily basis when it's networking. So yeah, people will be like V1s and all that. I'm like, I know nothing about that. So I'm lucky I have colleagues who like Richard and Simon who know other things that I don't. So I make use of their knowledge. I wouldn't try and know everything because that's just impossible, especially in Azure. So yeah, I learn from their diagrams. I ask lots of questions. Like when we first did a hub spoke network, I had no idea what that was. I had to ask the guy Remco, my boss. I was like, "What is a hub spoke network, and why would you use it?" And now we use it on lots of designs. It's very popular for good reasons. But back then, I had absolutely no idea what hub spoke network was, and I didn't know why it was called that. And now obviously I do. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. Definitely ask people who have got more knowledge than you. That's what these things are for. Come on here and ask questions if you're stuck.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
yeah.
When we're looking to enhance or if you like, grow the Azure team in Ergo, the company I work in, we've got two choices. We either hire in somebody who already has that experience, so it's somebody kind of senior, or we bring somebody in from internal, from our managed service team, or maybe a graduate, and over time, we've done exactly what you said, Gregor. We've let them shadow, we've aligned them with certifications, so they must have the relevant certifications before we let them out in the wild, because I love your phrase, you know enough to be dangerous. When you're dealing with corporate workloads, you could potentially open up a security hole that could just cause an absolute nightmare and possibly even litigation against your company. So I think if you're smart about it, and if you've got the right structure and you surround yourself with the right people, and you back that up with certification, and look, the certs are relatively straightforward for people to brain dump and cheat on if they really want to, right? So they're really important because you learn a lot from them. If you want to learn, if you don't want to just memorize a bunch of answers, go into the test center, do the test, and come out with just near 100% mark. But if you'd rather look at them and say, right, I'm going to pass this the best I can. Like the Azure DevOps exam I did was probably the toughest exam I've ever done in Microsoft, because it just was so out of my comfort zone. And I scraped the pass. I think I got 730 out of 1,000 on it, right? But I learned a bunch of stuff, right? I learned a bunch of stuff from it. Whereas other exams, because we look back at some of the certs that I've done over the years. I'm looking at the first one I did. I think we talked about this in Prague over at Experts Live a few weeks ago. Was networking essentials in the Windows NT4 track, and it was just network. So that was
before my days,
20 years ago, like 20 odd years ago. So I've got that kind of pedigree, but the DevOps stuff was really uncomfortable to me. And when I got my first job in IT, like proper IT job, I had four of these Microsoft exams. And I'd studied really hard for them, and I built a load of old computers in my mother's house. I was living at home at the time. Built a bunch of old school computers, like they were being thrown out. They were in the skip, and I had to figure out what a power supply and a hard drive, all the simple stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then networking, which was a dark art to me. Like, how does that talk to that, and protocols? And so I got my first job. Well, actually, I went for an interview for my first job. And the interview, I was quite naive. I probably didn't, it sounds stupid, but I didn't expect for the interview to be technical questions. That sounds stupid now, right?
No.
It was a long, long time ago, right? Because I'm in Ergo nearly 20 years now, right? So I went, and really, really good guy that was interviewing me. And he was just doing what we would all do now if we were interviewing somebody, asking those hard questions. How, if you heard a beeping noise here, what would you do? Or if that couldn't come, stuff like that, and I left the interview, and I rang my wife, and she said, "How did you get on?" I said, terrible interview. It was the worst interview. I was questioning my decision to even go into IT, because I thought, you know what, I had these exams. The results, I didn't cheat in them, but I did well in them because I probably over prepared for them, but what I didn't have, and that's back to the original point, what I didn't have was the real world experience, the hands-on. I had a little bit of exposure in a really, really small SMB kind of environment, but I didn't have that hands-on. But the interviewer rang me on the Monday and said, "Hey, look, we loved you. We'd love you to start." And I said, "I don't understand. I thought it was a terrible interview." And what he said to me was, he said, "Kev, look," he said, the questions I asked you, and they were totally fair. It wasn't an unfair interview. The questions I asked you, I was looking for how you would do it. And the way you would do it is the long way around. So you would, if you had experience, you'd probably give me a much quicker, more concise answer. but the answers you gave me were still correct. It's just clear you don't have that real world experience.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't for a senior role anyway, but I was really happy that person gave me a chance, and that certainly wasn't in the Azure world, but it taught me a lesson that, you know, the theory will only take you so far, and you need that real world hands-on. And if you don't get that, if you don't have the people in your company or in the community to give that to you, and you're serious about going down that route, then you probably need to look at getting to a position where you're in a company or you're surrounded by people who can give you that shadowing experience.
Yeah, you want to try and join, like at our company, graduates will come in, or kind of new people who haven't had that hands-on experience and advice yet. So they come in and then they kind of get they shadow people for quite a wee while, and they kind of learn things just like what you're saying. And that's how people who are looking to get into the cloud, that's how you should start. Try and find a company with programs like that where they'll take you in. You don't know anything about Azure, but they'll train you up, and they'll ask you to do the exams. They might ask you to do the exams before you join. That's fine. But if you've got the willingness and the drive to do it, then like you did, you'll get the job, and you'll learn this stuff as you go. Because I had to do that. I was nowhere near an Azure Architect level when I first started. I was perfectly honest when I said that. It's like, can you do this design? And I was like, I have no idea how to do this. So just learn it as you go. Yeah. Right, carrying on, we've got soft skills and best practices. So I think this is always overlooked. Your soft skills are, I'm on calls with people who don't speak English very well on a daily basis. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but I have to try and speak slowly, which I'm not very good at coming from Scotland. So you need to have good communication skills. So as part of being an Azure architect, you need to be able to explain in simple terms how Azure services communicate with each other. You need to explain your documents to the nth degree, because customers are always like, I don't understand this part, please explain. So you need to learn to be able to communicate well, spoken and written formats. So that's always overlooked. But if I'm interviewing someone, I always ask them questions about communication, and then what happens if you do X and Y, just to see what they say. So communication skills are often overlooked, but you need to be able to diagram what you're suggesting as a solution. You need to explain that solution and make sure that it is correct. So I always get someone to check up my work that I do. So that's me just making sure that what I said is accurate and correct. Because as we know, these services update every day, and you might have said something that was valid 6 months ago, but it's not valid now. Like, for example, I'm always getting caught out when I do workshops with Azure Storage, and I'm like, I'll just click here and that bit's gone and it's been changed to something else. That catches me out on probably a monthly basis. I wish to tell you when they were updating the portal, but it's just not a thing. Security and compliance, huge. Make sure you know what Azure Active Directory is. Make sure you know what RBAC is, so role-based access control. Do reading up on things like Key Vault, so you know how to store secrets and passwords, and don't just hard code them in solutions. I see developers, I'm a developer, I still see people trying to hard code them and check them into Git. Learn how to do that properly. Learn how to do Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. Learn how to do DevOps properly with pipelines, repeatable pipelines, so that when someone checks the code in, it builds the code, runs the tests, and then deploys it to a test environment which you can promote. Do all the right things. Read up on all this. There's best practices. Always put best practices in the search term, and they'll keep you right. One last thing, or two last things, cost management. I'm actually speaking with a customer just now who cost management is not a thing. Their cost management is millions over what it should be. So you need to kind of build cost management in from the get-go. So you can do that by adding things like Azure budgets to your subscription. So just like a shopping budget, you've got $100 a month, put in $1,000 a month for your subscription. If it's heading towards that, you'll get an alert. If it's going to go over that, you'll get an alert, and you'll know if someone's deployed something or if you've left something running. It's going to go over your budget for the end of the month. Learn cost management. It is vital. There's multiple things to cost management. There's all sorts of tools you can use. Azure Advisor is very good at doing cost management, but there's also other things like log analytics. Seen a lot of customers like turn on logging for AKS and it doesn't show up, and it's not that easy to find. But when you look at the log analytics logs for AKS workloads, it's thousands of dollars a day because someone's turned on all logging. So you need to learn and kind of try and learn about all of the different facets of cost management. The
Yeah,
main one is
sorry, Gregor, I'll just give some tips on that one really quickly. Cost management, 100% agree from the start, from the very start, get it in. Understand that you can assign, depending on your Azure licensing, whether you're on an enterprise agreement or an MCA or whatever, you can assign budgets at the management group level or at the subscription level, right? So that's the first thing to consider. Budget's really important. A lot of folks haven't heard of anomaly reports. Anomaly reports are great. So you enable anomaly reports in your Azure cost management, and a scenario like you just mentioned there, Gregor, with the AKS, maybe, you know, you've got a workload and it's been ticking away at maybe $50 a month or something, and all of a sudden tomorrow somebody does something on it and it just generates, you know, an extra 2, 3, 4 times the amount. Instead of it sitting there waiting until you get the bill at the end of the month, within a few hours, the anomaly report will ping you and it will say, hey, this is unusual. This is outside the norm. You should be aware of it. And then you can build automation around it, or you can just manually go in and fix up that workload. But there's so many areas of it. And then using the free service like Azure Advisor, there's a cost management section in there that will talk to you, and it will literally say, hey, you should consider reserved instances for those databases and storage accounts and VMs, or you should consider a new Azure savings plan. All that cool stuff. So if you're not familiar with Azure cost management, again, we'll drop a link to it into the chat. Do get comfortable with it well before you start thinking too deep into how complex your Azure architecture looks. Cost management should be one of the fundamentals.
Yeah, no, very good tips. Yeah, definitely. Right, the last one is continuous learning. So how do you keep up to date with this stuff? One tip I continually see from kind of people who are really high up in the industry is create focus time. So I've started on a Tuesday and a Thursday, I book 2-hour slots where I just fill my calendar and I just put focus time and I put out of office. And that means I'm going to spend 2 hours on Tuesdays and 2 hours on Thursdays learning about all of this new stuff that's come out. So I might go and try OpenAI. I might go and try ChatGPT things. I might go and do whatever's new and I want to go and try that. So if you can, not everyone can, but if you can, try and create time and dedicate time to learning about all of these new services. But there's a lot to learn, and it's difficult. The cloud landscape's dynamic, as we know. It's always changing. But if you want to be effective in the role as an Azure architect, you really do need to try and keep up to speed with this, especially the areas that you're deep in. If you remember the T thing, if you're deep in one area, you definitely need to keep up with that. And just before we go, the last thing I wanted to talk about is how is AI changing my role as an Azure architect. So I've seen some really cool demos recently where a guy on ChatGPT basically had a diagram and he drew the diagram and imported it. I think it was even using the same plugin that Tim was showing, and it actually explained what was in the document in the picture. And I was like, that's impressive. So things like if you're a developer, definitely have a look at Gab Copilot X. Some of the stuff that's coming in that is just crazy. If you're familiar with Copilot in Visual Studio, you can ask a question and I'll give you an answer, but Copilot X is kind of that on steroids. That's the next thing where you can actually have a conversation and ask it to fix your code. You can actually say, in this block of code on lines 25 to 30, is there a bug? And it'll say yes, and then it'll say, can you fix it for me? It's bananas. Absolutely brilliant. There's lots of other cool stuff coming. So, yeah.
Sorry, Greg. Can you talk about if there's any set career path that to lead to architect? Like if someone's a DevOps engineer and want to lead to, is this more experience that you need?
So I'll give you what we do at Intercept. So you join Intercept with let's say you join Intercept with no Azure experience. You would start off as an Azure engineer. So you're given the path of doing the AZ900 fundamentals. This is while you're still shadowing people. You start off with fundamentals. Then you would probably look at the what's the AZ104? The administrating Azure. You would probably do that next. And then depending on what you want to start doing, you could do the data, you could do AI, you could do whatever. I went 900, which is the fundamentals. Then I did the developer exam. There isn't any one set path, by the way. As long as you do the Azure Architect exam, which is the end goal for most people, that's like AZ305, I think the number is now. That covers all of Azure though. So you need time. It's like flying a plane, right? Pilots have to fly 10,000 hours in a plane before they'll get accepted for flying at a large plane company. You need time in the cockpit of Azure, hands-on learning before you're ever going to be an Azure architect.
I just want to add that you don't need a set period of years as well. So you don't need
No,
4 years experience in DevOps engineer before.
no. I had probably 2.5 years experience in Azure, and that was just me learning. That wasn't hands-on day-to-day. And I got a job as an Azure architect, and I just learned quickly. So it's also down to the person. But most places you start off the bottom and kind of work your way up, and that's fine. But I wouldn't put any time zones on it or anything like that. Depends on the person and how much time you've got to dedicate to learning, I guess. And that's me. That's how I became an Azure architect. So I've been doing Azure for 5 years. I absolutely love doing it. Still got lots to learn. I've even passed the networking exam, which was a big one for me because I questioned myself, could I do this? I still don't know much about things like ExpressRoute and virtual WANs and all that, but I did enough to pass the exam. Could I do networking? Could do some of it, but the reason why I did that exam was to fill in the gaps because I'm doing virtual networks and subnets and all the kind of generic stuff day in, day out. So I learned that. Could I do the deep stuff? No. But we have other people at Intercept who I would ask to help me with that. So I'm never going to learn all that to the level that I would need to be like an Azure networking engineer. I'm not that person. I'm an Azure developer, really. So yeah, hopefully that helps. If there's any questions in chat, then please just let me know.
Don't see any more questions in the chat. I think that was really informative, Gregor. I think.
Yeah.
So that was last minute, made up on the spot. So all good.
They're often the best ones, though.
Yeah, 5 slides.
No scripting, no death by PowerPoint.
No, just chatting about what I did. Yeah.
Just shoot the breeze.
Kevin, what was your path? What did you do?
Okay, so I started out as so I went to college, didn't finish a degree, right? You know, the pubs and the nightclubs were calling me. So I started out as an office junior. Actually, I was just needed money to go partying. So it was really boring. It was nothing to do with IT at all. Just literally just filing documents in an accounts office. A friend of mine I'd been in college with had gotten a job repairing printers and fax machines and multifunctional copiers. So again, not super IT related, but you know, a little bit of technology because some of those multifunctional printers and copies, and this is going back to 1998, right? So some of them had to be connected to networks, and I didn't understand IP addressing and subnetting. And at the time, there was Novell networks, and there was IPX, SPX was the protocol, and then it was Windows NT, and you know, it fascinated me, all that stuff. So I was annoyed. I'm quite a keen learner like yourself, Gregor, and I'm sure you're the same, Nick, where I was annoyed at myself that I didn't understand what a lot of the stuff meant. You know, somebody would tell me, put in an IP address, put in a subnet, put in a gateway, and it worked, but I didn't understand it. So I did some digging on the basic internet that we had back then. Right? It wasn't, there's no Google. And I found that Microsoft had this track of exams, and it was the MCSE, which was the Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer. And it was 4 exams. The first one being Networking Essentials. Then it was Windows NT4 Workstation, NT4 Server, and NT4 Server Enterprise. And I just said, look, do you know what? It was like 130 Irish pounds at the time for the 4 books. Crazy money. I'd save up for about a month, right? Because I was only earning pennies. But I got the books and I loved it. I just got the bug. I just was fascinated by how all that worked. And slowly but surely then the company I worked for doing the printers, as the multifunctional printer and photocopier technology got better, you know, most people wanted to connect their devices then to networks, which now is just a straight up given, right? But back then it was optional. And I kind of became the networking guy there, and looked after their computer systems, and was a Windows small business server with Exchange and IIS and stuff I didn't know about, but did more exams. And that was then I felt I've come to that point now. I want to go for a job as a proper computer engineer. And that was the interview I spoke about earlier, which I thought I did really bad. And then just from there, just IT pro, kind of driving around the country in a van, fixing servers, deploying them, building them. Very, very IT pro centric, networking, firewalls, SANs, routers, all that type of stuff. And then slowly but surely morphed into a more specialist area. And I would say that to people, when you get to a point where you have your exams and you're on that kind of IT path, whatever it is, at some point you should start looking at becoming a specialist in an area, whatever that area is, an area that you're passionate about, because otherwise you'll just be a really good generalist. And organizations will always need good generalists, but with the pace of the way cloud and other technologies are moving now, I think you'd be left behind. So get the basics, get the core certification, get the knowledge, get the real world experience, the hands-on, and then figure out where am I going to focus. And my focus area was System Center, monitoring. So monitoring was my specialty area for years. And then it just kind of morphed in as System Center moved into Azure Monitor. And, then with my networking and my IT pro background, it just made sense just to go into Azure infrastructure. And here I am now.
If we've got time, Nicholas, what was your career path so far? You don't mind
Again, sir?
What's your career path so far?
So my career path was I was IT, so I was doing IT support, then help desk, and then it was in DevOps was last year was my first year in DevOps in world. So
cool.
So it's quite a good experience.
And what do you want to do long term? Do you want to become an architect, or what have you got?
I want to stay technical, so I don't know whether I want to be a solution architect with the clients, but I'd rather just be a technical like myself more.
Cool.
So whether it's just like a technical specialist or a senior thing special without actually designing. So we'll see where the future holds. So let me end the stream. So let me go. Okay, so let me end the stream.